Okay, today's day 24 of Bible in 90 Days, or What's in the Bible, where we're reading through the entire Bible from cover to cover, Genesis all the way to Revelation, just to get an idea of what the full story or what the full picture of the Bible is, because I think that gives us good context, when we're beginning to study in depth certain verses or certain chapters or books, or just to kind of get a feel of certain theological things and certain things that people talk about. So that's why we're reading through it, because I think it's great. I mean, we read novels all the time, we watch movies and in full all the time. We do things in full, so why not read the whole Bible in its entirety, just to see what it talks about. So today is day 24 of what we'll be doing. Yesterday, as we said, David's probably challenging times, as a king, and everything that that went on. So if you've not seen the video, just find it on the Facebook page or on the YouTube channel. So today we're going to finish off the book of 2 Samuel. Then we're going to go into the book of 1 Kings. So the books are just coming and going at this point. So 2 Samuel 23 all the way to 1 Kings chapter 7. So 2 Samuel 23, we hear about the warriors that were in David's army, as it's kind of capping off the story of David. So we get to hear the people that helped him, their qualifications or how good they were, or the things that they did. So David had a lot of strong people, or great warriors around him. We then hear another psalm that David writes, just kind of capping off his life, things that had happened in his life and the victories that God had given him. 2 Samuel 24, we hear about a plague that comes on the land because of David's sin, because David decided for some reason, scripture says now God pushed him to do it, or the devil pushed him to do it, which we will see when we get to 2 Chronicles. However, after he had done this, he realizes that there was a problem. There was then a plague on the land, and what then happens after that is David is given a choice of three things that could happen. He chooses the one thing, and he has to then make an offering to make sure that this plague would go away. We then hear about David's prayer at that time. That's the end actually of 2 Samuel, the book of 2 Samuel. Then we get into the book of 1 Kings, which is probably more appropriate for the things that we're talking about, because we're still talking, and probably until we get to the end of the Old Testament, it's all about the kings that reigned over Israel and the other kingdoms that came later on. So 1 Kings, David is now very old, he's about to die, but his successor to the throne is not yet selected. Adonijah, who was I think second after Absalom, I think David's son, he presumes to be king. He invites a bunch of people. He excludes certain people, but he invites a bunch of people, makes this big fanfare that he was now king, which is not something that had been agreed with David or with anybody else, but he simply kind of took that on. So we then get Bathsheba, Nathan, and Zadok, the other priest, who come to David and explain the situation, and David is aware. Then at this point, David then makes Solomon the new king of Israel. So Solomon now is the third king of Israel. So it actually says King Saul was a king for 40 years, King David was a king for 40 years, and now we're getting into the time of of Solomon. So at this point, now that Solomon has been made king, Adonijah is now in a bit of a situation, and he's now afraid for his life. But Solomon spares him at this time. 1 Kings chapter 2, we hear then about the death of David. So David finally dies, and the parting instructions that he gives to Solomon, some of them were just practical things about the kingdom, and some of them were just to say, listen, you need to follow what God says, you need to follow his law and continue in that way. After that, Solomon then starts to kind of clean house by getting rid of people like Adonijah, which was actually self-inflicted because he made a crazy request. The priest Abiathar, who had gone with Adonijah, Joab and Shimei, all those kind of people start to get cleaned out. 1 Kings chapter 3, God appears to Solomon in a dream, and he kind of asked them, Solomon, what do you want? And instead of asking for things like wealth or power or riches or whatever else, Solomon simply asks for wisdom, because he wanted to rule the people of Israel properly, because he was saying to himself, he was out of his depth, so he needed wisdom to be able to lead that kingdom properly. So God is very pleased with this, and he ends up giving him the wisdom, of course, as well as the wealth and the riches, and everything else beyond measure. This wisdom is actually tested straight away as we see a scenario about two prostitutes that came, I think, in regards to a dead baby, which is it's really fascinating how Solomon ends up solving that issue because of the wisdom that he now had from God. 1 Kings chapter 4. We hear about King Solomon's government and the people that he put in place, his commanders, etc., etc., and the provisions that he would get on a daily basis, just to kind of give you an idea of the scale of the riches and the organization of of the kingdom. So it also takes a pause there at that point to say, listen, things were really good in Israel at this point. There was peace, there was food, the kingdom was in power, nobody was warring against them. Everything was good, at this point. We then also hear more information about the wealth of Solomon and how his wisdom was more than any other person. 1 Kings chapter 5, the preparation for the temple begins. So this was a huge thing as far as the history of the Israelites is concerned. So preparation now, because if you remember, they used to have a tabernacle, with the tents and the Ark of the Covenant and the utensils and the tables and the things, like that. But they used to be kept in a tent. But now that they were in the promised land, the wars had stopped, everything was now peaceful, they could now build this temple. We then hear about a treaty with a king called Hiram, who would provide some of the provisions that were needed to build the temple. So again, I just put a note that say it was a place to worship and to sacrifice, because at this point they really didn't have anywhere to do that. But this temple was going to be this new thing where God would say he would dwell in this temple. 1 Kings chapter 6, we then hear the details about the building of the temple and God appearing to Solomon again whilst this temple is being built, and just reinforcing and reiterating how important it would be for him to follow God's laws, so that everything would be good with him as far as protection and provision and general relationship with God. We then have more details about the temple and how it was built. I think if you go on YouTube, you might actually find some information as well on Solomon's temple, just to see some 3D images of what it might have looked like. 1 Kings chapter 7, which is today's last chapter, we get to see some of the other things that were built by Solomon, some houses, some palaces, etc. Then the dedicated things that David had set aside are taken from the treasury and put into the temples. So tomorrow we continue on and get to hear more about what happened in King Solomon's reign over Israel. I'll see you guys tomorrow.